June 4th, 1945. The Texas Desert. The heat inside the Pullman car was a physical weight, pressing 110-degree air thick with coal smoke and sour sweat against Kiyo Tanaka's skin. The green vinyl shade was pulled low, mandated by the guards, but a sliver of blinding white light cut in, illuminating the grit dancing in the air. Kiyo, internee tag, 3345, pinned to her linen blouse, stared at the armed man sitting at the end of the car. He wasn't a soldier, not army. He wore a simple khaki uniform with an INS patch, immigration. His holster, worn low, held a dark Colt M1911 pistol. "Mizu," her younger sister Hana whispered, her voice cracking, "Water." Kiyo shook her head, focusing on the sliver of landscape outside. For 4 days, since leaving the processing center in New Orleans, it had been the same. Flat, dead, yellow earth under a sky so vast it felt like a judgment. This was America. It was not the glittering metropolis of propaganda films, nor the decadent ruin promised by the radio. It was nothing. An empty furnace. "Koko wa doko?" Hana whimpered. "Where is this?" An older woman across the aisle, captured with them in Lima, leaned in. Her eyes were dull. "They said the name at the station," she rasped. "Tekisasu." 4 years earlier, Lima, Peru. 4 years before the train, there was the damp. Lima's garua, a fog so thick it was more like a coastal drizzle, clung to the windows of her father's office on the Avenida Science Peña. Kiyo Tanaka traced a character, Shizuka, quiet, onto the glass, watching the Peruvian shoppers below. It was 1941. At 18, Kiyo understood her world through her father's axioms. They were Japanese. They were guests in this country, and they were superior. "Hana," she called, her voice sharp, reverting to Japanese. "Stop touching the export silks. You'll leave prints." Hana, 8 years old, pulled her hand back from a vibrant red bolt, her face falling. "Kiyo-chan," their father Isamu said gently from his desk. He did not look up from his abacus, the wooden beads clicking in a rapid, precise rhythm. "She is just curious." "She must be disciplined," Kiyo replied, her posture rigid. "They watch us." "They," Isamu sighed, "are our customers." But his calculations slowed. The clicks became hesitant. The lists of enemy aliens had begun circulating. An anti-Japanese sentiment, once a low hum, had become a shout in the streets. His business, importing goods from Yokohama, was drying up. The United States, far to the north, was pulling strings, and Peru was complying. Kiyo felt only disdain. This garua fog was like the Peruvian mind, wet, heavy, and weak. She missed the crisp air of Yokohama, which she had visited only once but held in her mind as a shrine. She was Yamato Damashi, the Japanese spirit, trapped in a foreign land. The click-clack of the abacus stopped. Kiyo turned. Her father was staring at the doorway. 2 men in the dark green, uniforms of the Guardia Civil, stood there, their faces impassive, their holsters unstrapped. "Senor Isamu Tanaka?" one asked. "Hi," Isamu replied, rising slowly. He placed his hands on the desk. "Usted está en la lista," the officer said flatly. "You are on the list. Venga con nosotros." Kiyo's breath hitched. She looked to her father, expecting rage, demanding the Japanese embassy be called. But Isamu simply looked at his desk. He picked up the abacus, held it for a moment, and then set it down. He adjusted his tie. "Kiyo," he said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "Take care of Hana, Gaman. Endure." They took him. Kiyo stared at the abacus on the desk, the polished wood suddenly inert, its logic gone. The fog outside pressed against the glass, and for the first time, the damp felt cold. The journey north was a smear of degradation. They were cargo, After being herded onto a small vessel in Callao, they were transferred at the Panama Canal Zone, a humid, green hell, to a larger, gray ship. A soldier stenciled USAT Frederick C. Ainsworth on its side. Kiyo, Hana, and their mother were assigned a cramped lower deck bunk, the air thick with the smell of diesel, unwashed bodies, and the sharp chemical tang of disinfectant. For 12 days, the ship groaned north. Kiyo's world shrank to the 3-foot space of her bunk. She held Hana during the frequent bouts of seasickness, whispering the only word that mattered, gammon, endure. She watched the American guards. They were young, loud, and chewed gum incessantly, the rhythmic mastication seeming to her a sign of profound disrespect. They were not the disciplined warriors of Imperial Japan. They were sloppy, and that sloppiness made them dangerous. She kept Hana's back to them at all times. Her mother, stripped of her status, seemed to fade. It was Kiyo who fought for their ration of watery stew and hard bread, who ensured Hana drank the chlorinated water. She refused to be sick, fueled by a cold, clarifying rage. These Hakujin, white people, had stolen their lives, and she would not give them the satisfaction of her tears. On the 13th morning, the engine's thrum changed. A different light filtered through the porthole. Kiyo climbed onto the top bunk, ignoring the guard's shout, and pressed her face to the thick glass. It was gray water, a gray sky, and rising from the mist, a colossal green-black figure, a woman holding a torch. Other internees whispered the name Liberty. Kiyo stared at the statue. Propaganda films in Lima had shown it as a beacon of hope. Now, seeing it through the grime of the porthole, guarded by men with rifles, Kiyo saw only the monstrous open maw of the cage she was about to enter. The torch was not a light. It was a warning. She stepped down, her face a mask, and woke Hana. "Get your bag. We are here." Life in Barrack 22 settled into a grinding, sun-bleached monotony. The world was defined by dust and schedules. 6 a.m., the siren for roll call. 7 a.m., the mess hall. 10 p.m., lights out. Kiyo established her own routine within the cage, one of resistance. She refused to speak English, even though she understood it perfectly. When the mess hall served boiled potatoes and beef stew, heavy, greasy, and smelling of unfamiliar spices, she would eat only the rice, if any was offered. She spent her meager camp scrip at the canteen not on soap or candy, like the other women, but on smuggling a small, precious bottle of shoyu, soy sauce, from a Nisei internee who worked in the kitchens. This, she told herself, was how they would survive. They would remain Japanese. Hana, however, was adapting. At 12, she was resilient in a way that terrified Kiyo. She picked up English phrases from the other children, her accent perfect. "They have a school, Ane-san," Hana said one afternoon, shading her eyes from the glare. They were watching a group of boys on a dusty field. Kiyo followed her gaze. It was the camp's high school. The boys were older, Japanese-American Nisei, born in America. They wore baseball uniforms, swinging bats and shouting in English. "Hey, batter, batter, swing!" A wave of profound cold disgust washed over Kiyo. They were Inu, dogs. They wore the enemy's uniform, played the enemy's game, spoke the enemy's language, all while their people were at war. She saw them as weak, their blood thinned by American soil. They had forgotten Yamato Damashi. "That is not a school," Kiyo said, her voice flat. "It is an indoctrination center. You will not go." "But Kiyo," Hana protested, "they learn arithmetic, and they have books." "We have gammon," Kiyo snapped, grabbing her sister's arm, pulling her away from the fence. "That is all the education we need." Hana's face crumpled, but she went silent. Kiyo ignored the sting of her sister's resentment. It was necessary. To bend, even slightly, was to break, and Kiyo would not break. The camp was a sealed box, but information, like the Texas dust, found ways to seep in. The only official news came from the camp's mimeographed newsletter, the Crystal City Times, or the censored, week-old copies of the San Antonio Light. Kiyo scanned them with contempt. All propaganda, filled with reports of American advances that were obvious lies. The empire, she knew, was invincible. The divine wind would protect them. She sought out the real news in the laundry house, a long concrete building filled with steam and the acrid smell of lye soap. It was the camp's nerve center, run by the Issei, first-generation women. Here, insulated by the rumble of the ringers, they spoke freely. The radio from the men's side, Mrs. Watanabe whispered, scrubbing a sheet on the washboard. They say we have taken a great naval base, Okinawa. Okinawa, Kiyo murmured, hope fluttering in her chest. A different voice, sharp and educated, cut through the steam. Not just Okinawa. It was Akiko, a Kibei, American-born but educated in Tokyo, and fiercely loyal to the emperor. She was Kiyo's only intellectual ally. Akiko motioned Kiyo behind a stack of linen baskets. The Americans lie about everything, Akiko hissed, her eyes bright with fanaticism. She carefully unfolded a brittle piece of newspaper, smuggled in a vegetable crate. It was a copy of the Asahi Shimbun, 6 months old. Look! Kiyo's fingers traced the headline, Jaithang Taivin Leyte, Hamjoy me bitio diet. Great victory at Leyte Gulf, American fleet annihilated. Kiyo stared at the dense, vertical text. Victory. She felt a profound sense of relief. And yet, a flicker of doubt. 6 months old. Why had they heard nothing since? Why were they still here, in Texas, if the American fleet was broken? The propaganda she wanted to believe felt strangely thin. The war will be over soon, Akiko whispered, folding the paper. They are weak. We are strong. Kiyo nodded, pushing the doubt down. Akiko was right. This was gammon. This was the test. She clung to the yellowed paper as proof. That night, at the mess hall roll call, the camp director, a harried INS man named Meacham, stood on a crate. He cleared his throat. Attention! By order of the administration, to boost morale, there will be a camp-wide summer carnival held on the baseball field, August 15th. A carnival. The announcement felt like a mockery. The announcement split the women's compound. In the laundry house, the steam was thick with indignation. A carnival, Mrs. Watanabe scoffed, her voice tight. They mock us. They starve our brothers and fathers in true prisons, and they offer us sugary poison. It is a trap, Akiko, the Kibei, declared to the group. A propaganda display. They want to film us, to show the Red Cross how happy their prisoners are. No one with Yamato Damashi will attend. We will boycott. A murmur of agreement went through the older Issei women. They nodded, their faces grim. To attend was to show weakness. To attend was to betray the emperor. Kiyo agreed. It was logical. It was honorable. Then she found Hana hiding behind their barrack, sniffing the air. The wind, for once, carried something other than dust. From the baseball field, where the INS guards were setting up stalls, came the faint, intoxicating smell of spun sugar and roasting peanuts. Ane-san, Hana whispered, her eyes wide and hungry. It smells sweet. It is poison, Hana, Kiyo said, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. Hana hadn't had sugar in almost 2 years. She was 12 years old, and her entire world was this 10-foot barbed wire. Kiyo felt torn. Her loyalty to Akiko's resistance was absolute, but her duty to Hana was primal. The conflict choked her. She needed guidance. That afternoon, Kiyo went to the visiting fence, the double row of barbed wire separating the men's and women's compounds. She saw her father, Isamu, standing, In the designated zone, thinner now, his hair grayer. They were not allowed to speak of the war, only of health. Hana is well, Kiyo said formally through the wire. She is tempted by the American carnival. She confessed it like a sin. Isamu watched her, his gaze unreadable. He looked past her, toward the half-built stalls on the baseball field. He seemed to study the red, white, and blue streamers flapping in the wind. Kiyo waited, expecting a sharp reprimand. Forbid her. Tell me to be strong. He turned back to her. He said nothing, but he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was not approval. It was an order. Go, see, know your enemy. Kiyo's stomach tightened. His permission was a heavier burden than a prohibition. It gave her an excuse to indulge Hana, but it made her responsible for what she would see. She felt a cold dread and a flash of shame. She was going to the enemy's party. I will take her, she said, bowing to her father, purely to observe their methods. The afternoon of August 15th was a flat, white heat. Kiyo held Hana's hand, her own palm sweating. She walked toward the baseball diamond with the grim determination of a soldier entering a minefield. She had warned Hana, do not eat, do not speak, watch and remember. They passed the first guard tower. As they neared the baseball backstop, the air changed. It was no longer silent desert heat. It was noise. A brassy, energetic music flooded the field, blasted from loudspeakers wired to the director's office. It was Glenn Miller's Chattanooga Choo Choo. The sound was overwhelmingly confident. Kiyo had never heard anything like it. It was music for dancing, not for marching. Red, white, and blue streamers were strung from the backstop to the guard towers, a grotesque parody of patriotism flapping against the barbed wire. The field was crowded. Nisei teenagers shouted in English, throwing baseballs at a stack of milk bottles. Ian's guards, their holsters still on, smoked cigarettes and laughed with internees. A man on stilts, dressed as a clown, handed out balloons. Kiyo stopped. This was not the grim propaganda film she had braced for. It wasn't a trap. It was a party. A real, chaotic, joyful party. The sheer waste of it hit Kiyo first. The waste of fabric for streamers. The waste of electricity for the music. The waste of energy. The softness. How could a nation at war allow this? How could they afford this much color in the middle of a desert? This was not the behavior of a weak, starving enemy. The smells hit her next. Not just the faint sugar from the barracks, but a thick, overwhelming cloud of hot oil, roasted peanuts, and something savory and meaty. It was the smell of surplus. Hana's hand tightened in hers. She wasn't looking at the games. She was staring, hypnotized, at the row of wooden stalls lining the third base line. "Ane-san," Hana whispered, her voice awed. "Look!" She pointed, her resistance forgotten. The smell was pulling her in. Hana tugged Kiyo's hand, and Kiyo, too stunned by the cognitive dissonance to resist, found herself being led toward the food. They stopped at the first stall. A massive steel pot bubbled over a propane flame, attended by a sweating Nisei man in a white apron. A hand-painted sign read, "Texas Chili Bowl, 560." Kiyo leaned closer, drawn by a morbid curiosity. The smell was overpowering. Not the clean, subtle scent of dashi or shoyu, but an aggressive, earthy aroma of cumin, hot peppers, and simmering fatty meat. It was dark red, almost brown, and bubbled thickly, glistening with a film of orange oil. "Two, please," said an INS guard in front of them. Kiyo watched, transfixed, as the Nisei attendant ladled a heavy scoop of the stew into a paper bowl. He then ripped open a small cellophane packet labeled saltine crackers and scattered the pale squares on top. The guard took the bowl, dumped in more hot sauce, and began to eat, standing right there in the blistering sun. He ate greedily, the plastic spoon bending, sweat running from his hairline into his eyebrows. Kiyo felt a wave of pure revulsion. It was niku, meat. So much meat, cooked into an unidentifiable, fiery paste. It was animalistic. It was food for field hands, consumed without ceremony, without beauty. To eat this heavy, hot slop in 100-degree heat, it was not just foreign. It was wrong. It was proof of their crude, barbaric nature. This, Kiyo thought with grim satisfaction, was the enemy. Heavy, artless, and wasteful. She looked down at Hana. Hana, who had been drawn by the general smell of food, now wrinkled her nose. The specific, pungent odor of the chili was too much. I don't want that, she whispered, stepping back from the stall. Of course not, Kiyo said, her voice sharp with vindication. It is not for us. She felt her gamin return, her resistance justified. She took Hana's hand to lead her away from the offensive display. But Hana didn't move. She was staring past Kiyo, at the next stall. Her eyes were wide, her mouth slightly open, fixed on an object she could not comprehend. "Ane-san," Hana breathed, her voice a strange mix of confusion and awe. She pointed. "Look at that." Kiyo turned. The stall was simpler. A large, bubbling vat of golden oil. Next to it, a tub of pale yellow batter. A sign painted in crude block letters read, "Corn dog, 5 sisa." She did not understand the words. She only understood the action. An INS guard, a different one, younger, stepped up. He handed over a nickel. The Nisei attendant, using tongs, pulled a brown, oblong object from the hot oil. The object was impaled on a flat wooden stick. He handed it to the guard. Time seemed to slow down. Kiyo watched, her mind struggling to categorize what she was seeing. The guard moved to a condiment table. He pumped a bright, chemical yellow paste, mustard, onto the object. Then he raised it to his mouth. He bit into it, standing up, holding the stick. He tore a piece away with his teeth. A wisp of steam escaped. Kiyo's brain tried to parse the logistics. It was a sausage. She recognized the shape inside the fried shell. They had taken a sausage, a piece of processed meat, put it on a stick, dipped it in corn batter, and then fried it again. It was the most profoundly wasteful, inefficient, and bizarre act of food preparation she had ever witnessed. It wasn't just wasteful, like the chili. It was redundant. It was food on top of food. It was frying something that was already cooked. And the stick. Why the stick? Was it so they could eat while walking? Was their need for convenience so great that they had engineered a way to consume fried meat without the burden of a plate or a table? The chili had been barbaric. This was something else. This was decadent. This was a level of surplus so vast it defied her understanding of war, of rationing, of gammon. Hana, however, was not analyzing the waste. She was watching the guard, who was now smiling, taking another bite. He wasn't poisoned. He was enjoying it. Before Kiyo could react, Hana dug into the small pocket of her dress. She pulled out the 5C script their mother had given her for the week. She stepped forward, her small hand trembling, and held the coin out to the attendant. "1," she said, her English small but clear. "Please." The Nisei man smiled. He took her coin, pulled a fresh, hot object from the oil, and handed it to her. Hana held it like a torch. She turned back to Kiyo, her eyes bright with terror and triumph, and held it up. Kiyo stared at the object. It was golden brown, glistening with oil, impaled on its strange wooden handle. It steamed in the dry air. Hana held it up to her, an offering, her small face a mixture of fear and pride. This was the moment. To refuse was to maintain gammon. To eat was to surrender. It was to accept the enemy's wasteful, decadent poison. Mrs. Watanabe and 2 other Issei women had approached, drawn by the same morbid curiosity. They stood beside Kiyo. their faces masks of disbelief. Nazi tate taberu no? Mrs. Watanabe whispered, her voice sharp with confusion. Why do they eat it standing up? Bachiatari, the other woman muttered. Sacrilege. Such waste. Kiyo stared at the stick. Her mind was racing, trying to find the military logic, the propaganda angle. There was none. It was just food. Hana, who had been analyzing the object with the intense focus of a child, suddenly looked up at the women. So you don't need a plate, she said, her voice clear. She shifted her grip on the stick. Or chopsticks. She smiled. The simplicity of it was a physical blow. No plate, no chopsticks. It wasn't decadent. It was efficient. It was convenience elevated to an art form. A strange sound bubbled in Kiyo's throat. She tried to suppress it, but it pushed past her lips. A short, sharp, choked sound. It was a laugh. The laugh shattered her. It broke the rigid posture of her gammon. In that single, absurd moment, the entire edifice of imperial propaganda collapsed. An enemy that was starving, as the Asahi Shimbun claimed, did not have surplus meat to fry twice. An enemy on the verge of collapse did not invent food on a stick for the simple convenience of not having to wash a dish. The chili was waste. This was power. Unthinking, effortless, casual power. They weren't weak. They were, Kiyo realized with a terrifying, hollow certainty, impossibly strong. We are losing. The thought had barely formed when a loud screech of feedback ripped across the baseball field. The Glenn Miller music cut off abruptly. The loudspeakers crackled. The voice of the camp director, Meacham, boomed over the field, strained and cracking. Attention! All internees, return to your barracks immediately. The war is over. For one long second, there was only the electric crackle of the loudspeaker. Hana's hand went limp, and the corn dog, forgotten, fell into the white Texas dust. Then the screaming began. It was not the sound of joy. It was a high, thin wail of disbelief. Mrs. Watanabe sank to her knees, her hands covering her face. But Akiko, the Kibe loyalist, turned on the nearest INS guard. Lies! She shrieked, her face contorted. Propaganda! It is a trick! The emperor is divine! Japan cannot be defeated! A group of Issei men, who had been allowed over for the carnival, joined her, shouting at the guards, demanding the real news. They wept openly, pulling at their hair, accusing the Americans of a monstrous deception. Kiyo watched them. She looked at their faces, desperate to believe the lie she herself had clung to only minutes before. She saw their pain, their faith shattering, but she felt nothing. No, that wasn't true. She felt a profound, horrifying emptiness. She looked down at the corn dog lying in the dust, the symbol of absurd, wasteful, effortless power. Akiko was wrong. The Asahi Shimbun was wrong. Her father was wrong. It was true. The gammon, the years of endurance, the cold rage, the meticulous resistance, all of it had been meaningless. Her father's sacrifice, their lost business, the humiliation of the Ainsworth, all for nothing. They hadn't been enduring a test of spirit. They had simply been captured. They had been observers to their own annihilation, distracted by a carnival. The bright red, white, and blue streamers suddenly looked cheap and garish. The Texas heat, forgotten in the excitement, pressed down on her again, suffocating. The American soft power had won. It hadn't defeated her with a bayonet. It had defeated her with a 5-cent piece of fried meat on a stick. Back to the barracks, now! The guards' voices were tight, nervous now. They began pushing the crowds, their hands on their holsters. Kiyo picked up Hana, who had started to cry, silently. Kiyo did not cry. She was hollow. She walked woodenly back to Barrack 22, the sound of Akiko's wailing fading behind her. The heavy door swung shut. A bolt slid home from the outside. The war was over, but the camp remained. The streamers were torn down, the music stopped, but the barbed wire and the guard towers stayed. The dust settled back onto the baseball field. They were ghosts. News filtered in, confirming the horrifying reality. Peru would not take them back. Their citizenship had been revoked. They were stateless aliens. The INS began processing some for repatriation to a Japan Kiyo had never known, now a land of ash and occupation. The camp's factions fractured. The Kibe loyalists went on hunger strikes. Others signed petitions to stay in America. Kiyo felt nothing but the profound vacuum left by her collapsed faith. There was no Yamato Damashi. There was no divine wind. There was only the heat and the wire. Weeks later, the compounds were finally allowed to mix. Kiyo and Hana found their father sitting on the steps of his barrack. He looked 20 years older. His posture, once rigid with the pride of Isamu Tanaka, was slumped. He looked, Kiyo realized, like the old abacus he had left behind, inert, its calculations finished. She sat beside him. She waited for him to speak of the emperor, of honor, of the great betrayal. Isamu stared at the dust for a long time. Finally he spoke, his voice a dry rasp. He did not look at her. "We must learn," he said. Kiyo frowned. "Learn what, Otu-san?" "The English," he said, the words sounding foreign and heavy. "It is the only way. We must learn." It was the death of the world. It was the absolute final surrender. He was not ordering gammon. He was ordering assimilation. He was ordering survival. The next morning, Kiyo walked Hana past the laundry house, past the mess hall. She stopped outside the building she had once despised, the one where the Inu played baseball. The sign still read Crystal City High School. The American teacher looked up, surprised, as Kiyo stood in the doorway, blocking the light. "May I help you?" the teacher asked. Kiyo looked at the strange maps on the wall, at the alien letters of the alphabet. She took a breath, the air tasting of chalk and dry paper. "My sister," Kiyo said, her English rough from disuse. "And me. We want to learn,"